Today's project is my cousin Richard's F-150 with a severe oil leak on the lower rear corner of the pushrod cover. He has very little mechanical experience, but a strong desire to learn. This is a perfect candidate, a trainable person who's eager to learn. We're going to start at the top of the motor and remove the easiest components first. The PCV hose is the first to be removed.
This is the idle air control of my truck. It's actually the modern version of a choke. I'm going to remove the plug to make it easier to access the tubes.
Then the air intake snorkel tubes. The only tool required is a common screwdriver to loosen the clamps. The air filter cover is removed with the air intake snorkel intact because it's faster and less risk for damage. With the air intake snorkel removed, it's easier to see the source of the leak. The upper radiator hose is attached to the motor at the water neck. Most engines have a thermostat underneath the water neck. Now would be a good time to change the thermostat if it's a consideration.
Oh, nice. Look at that stuff, Norman. You'll love that.
This motor needs a cooling system flush. That's a future job that Richard can tackle on his own. Working methodically, from top to bottom and front to back, the belt is next. A large breaker bar is plugged into the half-inch square hole in the ear on the belt tensioner, and the bar is rotated to release the tension on the belt. Check for a decal showing the proper routing of the belt prior to removal. Inspect the belt for damage. If you see glazing, shiny surfaces on the belt, it's a sure sign of slippage. With slippage comes a whole host of engine problems. Richard mentioned each time it rained, his check engine light would illuminate. His belt was severely worn and manifesting itself in computer-related issues because the computer was lacking proper voltage. With the belt off, it's time to remove the power steering pump. It's much easier to remove the power steering fluid with a turkey baster prior to disconnecting the hoses. The power steering hoses should be removed before loosening the mounting bolts to allow a more stable foundation. The power steering bracket is shared with the air conditioning compressor. There are several bolts to remove. Look carefully, some are hidden from view. The air compressor bolts are removed from below. Do not disconnect the hoses, and you will not need to unhook the electrical connector. The power steering pump is equipped with a high-pressure threaded hose that must be unscrewed, and a low-pressure return hose with a hose clamp. The hose clamp is a self-tensioning clamp that must be squeezed and slid down the hose to allow it to pass over the barbed fitting.
I'm going to put that pan under there.
The air conditioning compressor must be moved up and out of the way to allow the power steering bracket the necessary clearance. If you don't have help, a cargo strap works great. If not, a rope or a belt can be pressed into action. A plastic trash bag can turn any container into an oil-proof draining pan, even a cardboard box if you have nothing else. This power steering fluid should be red. It's jet black and it's the worst I've ever seen. To thoroughly drain it, rest it in a container and continue to work. Next, inspect the pulley for wear. The idler is worn and sloppy. There's no noticeable grinding when spinning the pulley, but there's a lot of side-to-side play. Meanwhile, work continues on the engine. The coil is next. Unbolt it and unplug it so it's not suspended from the wiring. The panel is hemmed in by the distributor, but removing the distributor cap is much easier than pulling the whole distributor in the long run, because removing the distributor requires retiming the engine. We removed the two shortest wires from the distributor cap to allow the clearance needed to remove the panel. Colored bread ties can be used to mark spark plug wires. Just snap a photograph prior to removal. It's now time to do what we came here for. Remove the bolts holding the pushrod cover. Pay special attention to the location of any studs. Once again, you could snap a photograph. The wiring harness is secured with one of the panel studs. The dipstick tube has a slip coupling that allows it to be removed for easier panel access. Richard found it easier to remove the rear panel fasteners from underneath the vehicle. If the panel gasket is seated tightly, it may need some persuasion with a prying tool. We used an automotive interior trim tool for several jobs. This was just one of them. Be careful not to bend the panel. Work along the edge, prying a small amount as you go until the whole panel is free. A small amount of pressure applied along the whole edge is much safer than prying in 2 or 3 locations. With the panel free, it's time to slide it forward, up, and out. We got a surprise when the front 2 plug wires were blocking the escape route and were quite stuck. To prevent damage to the plug boots, we used the trim tool once again to pop them free.
Yeah, man.
The old gasket was oil soaked and very brittle. It left remnants in the pushrod chamber. It's starting to look like it's gray again.
I always thought this part was black.
It was. Take this opportunity to clean and thoroughly inspect all the parts you removed. Replace them now if necessary. It saves a lot of time and money not doing the job twice.
And the water's off.
Old toothbrushes get recycled as parts cleaners. Well, if you see pretty big spots, clean those. We just focus on cleaning off the pretty big spots and stuff. The inside of the panel had baked on oil. Our engine soap couldn't touch it, so we pulled out oven cleaner designed to remove baked on messes. While the panel was soaking, the gasket surface was meticulously scrubbed with steel wool until it gleamed. Carefully remove as much as possible by hand, but upon completion, the oil and filter must be changed to remove any contaminants that entered the engine during the removal and cleaning of the gasket surface. Our next order of business was to remove the grommets from the mounting holes. Once again, the trim tool was pressed into action literally. The panel was rested against the hood latch, and the trim tool was pressed against the dry hardened rubber grommets until they popped free. The panel was not clean enough for my meticulous friends, so we called up a new method.
I'm using old brake fluid recycled from a brake fluid change.
Recycled brake fluid. Yes, we applied brake fluid to the surface and scrubbed it with steel wool and steel toothbrush. Even the baked on oil was no match. It cleaned carbon and cleans grease better than Dawn dishwashing detergent, and it cleans a mountain of greasy parts. The panel is super clean inside and out, and it's time for a thin layer of gasket sealer. It will hold the gasket in place so it doesn't slip or get pinched during installation. Richard carefully and methodically placed the gasket into the recess and ironed it down with the handle of the trim tool. This embedded the gasket into the sealant for a long-lasting, consistent seal. With the sealer cured, it's time to slip the panel back into position. 2 bolts were started without grommets to align the panel front to back, and then the grommets were installed. The trim tool was used once again to lever the back of the panel up to allow the alignment of the fastener. Next, the dipstick was realigned and the slip coupling was tightened.
Yeah, I did something right.
We installed the distributor cap off camera. The coil is next. I like to clean the white powdery corrosion from the distributor cap terminals and the rotor tip and contact spring with a small wire brush mounted in a Dremel tool whenever I remove the cap. This small job extends the life of the cap and rotor and can really save you money in the long run. Before we reinstall the power steering assembly, we're swapping the belt tensioner and the idler pulley. The air conditioning compressor has to be lifted up to allow clearance for the power steering mount to slide into position on the studs. Then it can be released to apply pressure to hold the bracket as the bolts are tightened. Let gravity be your friend. I'm going to put the AC in there and it'll tag it in place. You should be able to put the bolts in. Be sure to install all the nuts and bolts prior to tightening. Don't forget the aluminum spacer bar. When the mount is tight, install the power steering hoses. Reinstall the spark plug wires. Reinstall the air filter cover and the snorkel tubes and plug in the idle air control solenoid and reinstall the PCV hose. Yeah, what did they say about using a funnel? Reinstall the upper radiator hose, tighten the clamps with a ratchet, then fill the radiator with a blend of 50% distilled water and 50% coolant.
Remind you of something?
Buying premixed antifreeze saves time, but convenience comes at a cost. Would you ever consider paying $6 for a gallon of water? That's essentially what you're doing at 50% dilution. Next, the power steering pump is refilled. We are using an inexpensive fluid to fill and flush the power steering gearbox because it was heavily contaminated. Richard will check the fluid in a couple of days and drain it as necessary and fill it with fresh fluid, and then check it periodically. Power steering systems do not need to be bled. As the pump cycles the fluid through the reservoir, the air bubbles are removed. A new belt was installed because the check engine light was being set each time it rained. The belt was slipping and the computer was being starved for the necessary voltage to operate. When the vehicle first started, the improvements were quite noticeable. The idle was much smoother, the miss was gone, and the power had increased noticeably. It was time to take it for a ride.
When I brought the truck over, it was running very rough and it had a slight miss. As I went on with replacing the gasket to my pushrod cover, I also replaced my belt tensioner and my idler pulley, and I also put a brand new belt on. Once I heard the truck run, I realized that it runs much smoother. It started up very easy, and it idles very much better than it did before.
Richard was really quite shocked. He couldn't figure out how replacing a gasket could make the engine run better. He had overlooked the fact that the belt was really the cause of a lot of his problems. The computer needs proper voltage levels to calibrate and adjust the sensors, including the throttle position sensor.
Now I'm going to take the truck out for a test drive and see how it performs as far as power, idling, and acceleration.
Richard was so happy with the improvements and gained such confidence, he watched my video on how to change a throttle position sensor and an idle air control solenoid on a 1994 Ford Bronco and replaced the parts completely on his own, and his truck ran even better and smoother. If you enjoyed what you learned, please like and share. Subscribers are always welcome. Please leave a comment and I'll do my best to reply.
How do you think my mother felt when she gave birth to me, Norman?
That's a terrifying thought. From myself and Richard, thank you for watching. We hope to see you soon as I teach him more everyday vehicle repairs.